Morning. Before I turn to the subject of education that we wanted to talk about this morning, there are just a couple of other items in today's press that I just wanted to draw your attention to. Firstly, the letter from Field Marshal Lord Bramall and a number of other very senior military figures in the Times today, which I think is very significant because it sets out very, very explicitly from people with impeccable authority on the issue of Trident, precisely the argument that we have been making. In their words, it would be a strategic blunder to do what both the Labour and the Conservative parties want us all to do, namely commit up to £100 billion now on the full renewal of the Cold War Trident nuclear missile system when, as the generals explain in their letter, there are a number of other alternatives, cheaper alternatives which are not being explored, and when the strategic environment in the world is changing very fast, and when there is absolutely no need to take the decision now in any event. As they quite clearly say in their letter, there are several years to go before any decision is even required on what might or might not replace Trident. And secondly, the report from the IMF overnight that there should be a tax on banking profits, on the profits of banks. This is something that we have been advocating for some time now, as of course indeed we've been also advocating a very distinct position on the question of the renewal of Trident. And I think it is encouraging that issues which were dismissed when we first floated them and proposed them as somehow being out of the mainstream, impossible, are now finding such strong support from such authoritative quarters. And it is precisely, I think, what a general election campaign should be about. New ideas, trend-setting ideas, which then help provoke a wider debate. And one of the other ideas that we've also been advocating for some time that I would like to talk to you with David Laws about this morning is our proposal for a so-called pupil premium. The reason this is right at the core of our manifesto, the reason the pupil premium is the single biggest item of spending in our manifesto is for the following reason. We have a crisis of unfairness, a crisis of social immobility in Britain today. The bottom 20% of earners pay more tax as a proportion of their income than the top 20%. In my city of Sheffield, a child born in the poorest neighbourhood still today dies a decade and a half on average before a child born in the wealthiest neighbourhood, just a few miles away. And that gap has been getting bigger, not smaller. The Sutton Trust published groundbreaking research just, I think, a year or two ago, showing that a bright but poor child in school in this country now, on average, is overtaken in the classroom by a less bright but wealthier child by the age of 7. And that it becomes very difficult to close the gap after that point. That is a disastrous indictment of 13 years of Labour. Labour promised fairness in 1997, in 2001, in 2005, and what do we have? We have a country where if you're bright but you're poor, your life chances are blighted in the classroom by the age of 7, where just because of the circumstances of your birth, you're going to die a decade and a half earlier than other children, and where you are penalised by a tax system that lets you off if you're very wealthy, but squeezes you hard if you're not. That is what we want to change, and that is what the pupil premium will help to change. What is the pupil premium? The pupil premium is quite simply an additional £2.5 billion per year in our school system, which would raise the spending per head of child for the million children from the poorest backgrounds to roughly the same levels as support given to children in the fee-paying sector. It's money which would allow head teachers to devote the resources, the attention, the time, the support needed to make sure that every single child in the classroom moves forward with the rest of the class. We're all familiar with the problem with Oversized classes. We have 8,000 infants now between the ages of 5 and 7 who are in classes which are so big they're technically illegal. And we're all familiar with the problem when 4, 5, half a dozen children who maybe aren't being given the support they need at home, maybe just don't have the self-confidence to get their homework done on time, start dropping back from the rest of the class, start messing about, start being disruptive. And before you know it, you don't have one classroom or one group of children moving forward. You have several classes within one classroom. And you have a group of children who, before they've even started in their full educational career later in life, already are blighted before they've even got going. That is something that we must change. And that is what the pupil premium would do. It would allow head teachers to, on average, in an average primary school, reduce class sizes to 20. In an average secondary school, it would lead to a reduction in class sizes to 16. It could lead to more one-to-one tuition, Saturday catch-up classes, evening classes, whatever teachers and head teachers deem to be the right thing to provide the right kind of support, especially to those children who otherwise risk falling behind. It's funded from our £15 billion pool of savings and cuts, which we've detailed in full in the manifesto. It includes, or those savings include, close to £1 billion of savings from the current departmental budget in Whitehall here, which David can provide more details on if you want them. It is the biggest single financial commitment we're making in this manifesto, and in our view, it would go a long way to transforming the life chances of all of those children who still, despite all the promises and all the investment and all the so-called reform, are not getting the help they need in British schools. Thank you. David.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. As Nick has mentioned, the pupil premium is designed to tackle the biggest scar on the face of the education system in this country, which is the huge gap between the performance of youngsters from advantaged and disadvantaged backgrounds. And at present, if you're a child from a disadvantaged background, you're half as likely to leave at the age of 16 having achieved 5 good GCSEs. And we want to help to close that gap, which has remained roughly static over the last 13 years of a Labour government. Not only have the government failed to close that gap between the life chances of rich and poor children in terms of their educational performance, but actually the gap between the performance of disadvantaged youngsters in different parts of the country has grown quite rapidly under Labour, as Labour have been successful in some areas, particularly in inner London, at improving results, but they've been notably unsuccessful across swathes of the country, largely because they have not only not had the same degree of schools reform there, but also they've not had the same consistency of funding which is needed to deliver some of those characteristics of schools that Nick just spoke about. Because although there is some deprivation funding in the system at the moment, even on the government's figures, half of young people in this country attend schools which are not funded as disadvantaged or which are not in disadvantaged areas. So the point of the pupil premium is to do two things. Firstly, it's to raise the overall level of funding to tackle disadvantage, and that's the extra £2.5 billion that Nick spoke about, which will go into the school's budget. But secondly, it is to target that disadvantage much more effectively, because the existing crude funding formulae simply don't do that, whereas the pupil premium is tagged to pupils who have disadvantage, so it follows them to whichever school they're going to, and therefore it'd be far more effective than the systems of funding that are presently used.